This is a really special day for me, Election Day. After years of having to rely on someone else to go into the voting booth with me to pull the levers, it's a tremendous feeling for me to vote on my own for the first time since I started to lose my sight. To exercise my right privately, independently, like everyone else. This is truly a day to remember, a day that's been a long time in coming.
Voting is a basic right of Americans, a right that was denied to a significant number of Americans with disabilities for centuries. People with disabilities accessing the polling place was one problem. People dealing with the voting process was another. In this program, we'll look at the struggle that it took to allow a basic right to be exercised, the right to vote, and in particular, the hard-fought battle in one of the founding states, New York.
The 2000 presidential election and the debacle in Florida brought the need for election reform to a head. Congress responds to this need by passing the Help America Vote Act, or HAVA, in 2002. The new law provides states with billions of dollars to modernize their voting technology. It allows people with disabilities the right to vote privately and independently for the first time. And it mandates that at least one voting machine per polling place must be accessible to voters with disabilities.
The plan was to make voting more accessible across the country by 2006. But 2006 came and went, and HAVA was still not implemented in New York. The efforts of disability advocates were ignored and marginalized, while the dysfunctional New York State Legislative HAVA Conference Committee was more interested in preserving incumbents and House majorities.
Back in 1992, one of our staff at the center happened to read an article in which then Governor Cuomo was quoted as saying that more than 90% of the polling places in New York State were physically accessible to voters with disabilities. Over the next several months, center staff surveyed every single polling site in that three-county area, of which there were more than 150. And we found out, utilizing the currently acceptable accessibility standards at the time, that less than 10% of the polling places in that area met the accessibility standards that existed. We found everything from no designated accessible parking to doorway widths that weren't wide enough, to places that had 3, 4, or 5 steps up or steps down. Some were in the basement.
The New York Attorney General's office soon became involved.
The County Board of Elections and the county itself was aware of the Catskill Center's survey results of their polling sites and hadn't taken prompt remedial action.
So what they did in conjunction with the NYSILC, the New York State Independent Living Council, is they had representatives from the Attorney General's office go out with advocates to a number of polling places in several counties throughout New York State to see, if those polling places were accessible or were not accessible to people with disabilities. And it was done on one day. There was a sweep across the state on Election Day, 1999.
The counties admitted, even prior to the litigation and in the litigation, that the sites were not accessible. The counties just weren't taking the action necessary to fix it. So we sued. We prevailed on our preliminary injunction, and the court ruled that it was the county's responsibility to make the sites accessible. Some were accessible by the March 2000 primary. Unfortunately, not all the sites were done in time, but thankfully by November 2000, with the persistence of the Eastern Paralyzed Veterans Association, who was a wonderful monitor and really kept on top of all the counties, All of the sites in all 3 counties were accessible.
With 3 counties accessible, the remaining counties in New York still suffered from architectural, mechanical, and human barriers that were excluding persons with disabilities from the right to vote independently and confidentially.
HAVA still had a long way to go in New York. Since the Catskill study in 1999, the Disability Network engaged in a wide array of efforts to be part of the solution, from position papers to voting machine testing, from polling place access surveys to draft legislation.
The network did its part to support the passage of the Help America Vote Act in October 2002. The act clearly defined mandatory changes and timelines for all states, while providing New York with nearly $250 million in federal funds to help facilitate the changes.
It requires that there be one accessible voting machine in every polling place, and it, for the first time, sets a deadline, not just for voting machine access, but for wheelchair access.
We basically said you have 2 problems, the accessibility of polling sites and the machines that people vote on.
How was your message received? What were they telling you back?
When we sent every year to the County Board of Elections a survey of the polling sites that we visited, we really never got a response from them until we finally took it to court.
The New York State Independent Living Council, along with many other stakeholders, signed on to a minority report developed by Assemblyman Keith Wright, chairman of the Assembly Committee on Elections. The intent of this report was to communicate the collective dissatisfaction with the state's efforts. Its effect, however, was nil. What was the problem with the legislators not buying into what you were saying?
If all of a sudden there's this large group of people with disabilities who vote and people who prefer languages other than English, oh my gosh, that could change the status quo. The status quo got me into my position. I'm a little nervous about opening up the voting, so we're going to make this to help me get re-elected Vote Act, is what it came down to. There's no excuse. It was their own self-serving interest that they were dealing with first, while sacrificing access to our voting rights.
After George W. Bush signed HAVA into law, optimism was high. HAVA appeared to deliver the needed punch to provide full accessibility for voters with disabilities. But yet, as the state-by-state implementation process began to occur, New York State dragged its heels and put up legislative barriers.
What happened on the state level is what often happens on the state level. The interests are almost split half and half, and what the Assembly did, the Senate didn't want to do, and what the Senate did, the Assembly didn't want to do. And so it really was sort of more of politics as usual in Albany.
Some of it is, I really believe that there are people in power who want to stay in power and are fearful that if they give poor people, people with disabilities, the right to vote, they may not be in power anymore. And then I think that there's just a whole sense of, how do you define, we are living in a society that's built on the fact, in a lot of ways, that people with disabilities don't have rights.
To get to what we need, instead of wrangling around the politics of it, a lot could have been done without all the banter.
Keep wanting to revert to the State Board of Elections.
Somebody makes
the State Board of Elections, as we have said time and time again, are not, they're not functioning well. It's like the Addams family. They're dysfunctional.
A room full of increasingly frustrated disabled voters looked on as the debate droned over issues important to the 2 major parties. Again, the committee had shoved to the end of the agenda any discussion of making polling places accessible and new voting machines usable by all citizens. Frustration boiled over at that point. Loud chanting began.
Voting is a civil right! Access now!
Wheelchairs then moved to block the room's exits. Assembly Elections Committee Chair Keith Wright got an earful from two of the protest's organizers.
Here's the thing, we keep coming back to Albany to be involved in a public process that talks about our right to access the voting system. We want to have this done in front of us. We can't keep coming to Albany meeting after meeting, week after week.
You want to talk about identification and databases, we need machines. If we can't get into the polling place to vote, if we can't get into the polling booth and cast our ballot, what good is identification?
When they didn't act on our issue, when it was going to be business as usual, we let them know that business as usual was not going to happen. And we blocked the doors and wouldn't let them out.
The protest at the HAVA Conference Committee meeting in Albany drew significant media coverage. Barbara Nolan was one of the two people arrested for civil disobedience.
And they knew we were there. We were holding up signs. What about access to polling? What about touchscreen voting machines? They knew we were there. And one of our members who remained in the room when we blocked it off said to the committee, "We are no longer going to be at the back of the room and the bottom of the agenda."
As New York continued to lag on the issue, more lawsuits were filed in an escalating force of defiance against the situation.
The Department of Justice sued the state of New York, first ever lawsuit brought by the Department of Justice against the state to enforce the Help America Vote Act. That lawsuit was commenced on March 1st, 2006. New York has no excuse, and I don't think that even in the lawsuit, they ever really tried to excuse their conduct.
The state was retaliating against its own citizens who were demanding their right to vote after 200 years. And we needed to do something. We needed to say something. We needed to make a strong statement that said, we're not going to go away. We're going to stay here. We demand our rights.
The New York advocates have fought harder and stronger than any place else in the country to get accessibility. You just have a boneheaded, arrogant election system here.
Or what acts of voter discrimination have you actually been made aware of, or that you've seen, or firsthand?
We have a consumer who votes in actually Rockland County, who historically always did absentee because he couldn't get into the building, he couldn't use the machine. In 2004, he appeared at the polling sites. And the election inspector said to him, well, we have you down here as voting absentee. You can't vote here using the machine. They decided, well, you can vote, but after we clear off this line. Another 20 minutes go by because they wanted to clear up the backlog. I mean, there was a lot of anger towards him. He caused the backup, which wasn't true. Their process caused the backup. So it took him 35, 40 minutes to vote. And being insistent, if he backed off the minute they said, no, you can't vote here, he was discriminated. It should have been a 5-minute process. He was there 40 minutes. He was humiliated. He was made to wait and was treated like a pariah.
This is typical of the accessibility challenges that many polling sites present for voters with disabilities. And of course, the inaccessibility of the lever action voting machines for those of us in wheelchairs who are blind, and for our returning veterans with sensory, physical, and cognitive disabilities.
My significant other who uses a guide dog, when we enter the polling site, people all wonder how she's going to vote. And when she enters the polling booth with her Republican and her Democrat and her guide dog, you have the legs of the 3 people plus the guide dog, there are 10. And everybody wants to know what's going on in that polling booth. And that, makes them all listen.
There's no doubt that the full-face ballot discriminates against people with learning disabilities, cognitive disabilities. People just can't take in the information, or the equipment is not accessible in terms of being user-friendly for people with a variety of manual and coordination disabilities.
Polling places located in buildings with stairs where the accessible entrance is locked and guarded by police. Polling places that have accessible entrances that are locked, period, and no one knows where they are. Polling places in schools that are on the second or the third floor. Even when you get to the polling place, it's a matter of whether or not they know how to reasonably accommodate you when you get there. When someone with a serious disability inquires about the accessibility of their polling place, they are strongly steered in my county towards the absentee ballot.
What's the problem with an absentee ballot?
Well, ideally there shouldn't be a problem, but there's a question as to whether or not those ballots actually get counted and when they're counted, if they're counted at all. The prevailing wisdom is they're only counted in the vote of a tie, or they're counted last, or they can't find them because they're locked in a room. No one knows what the county does with absentee ballots.
The 2006 primary and election were hampered by a disparate distribution of ballot marking machines in the state. Take Erie County in western New York as an example. With almost 1 out of 5 residents ages 21 to 64 living with disabilities, only 1 ballot marking machine was purchased by the county. To make matters worse, a mandate was imposed that said you had to pre-register to use the one machine.
People didn't really care. We talk a lot about the importance of voting, but the boards of elections were given waivers. It's not like there was an actual mandate, or people even felt a moral obligation to provide access to people.
Primary Day 2006 was set as the deadline for full implementation of the law. Although that was not the case, significant strides were made nonetheless. Federal Judge Sharp had issued a Plan B court order for primary and election days 2006. Wanting to avoid what he referred to as electoral chaos, the judge ordered ballot marking devices at county-wide accessible polling sites, which averaged 1 per county. Advocates voiced their opposition to the decision. Even though the Plan B court order limited voting access to 1 site per county, people with disabilities were able to cast their first private and independent ballots on Election Day 2006. But still, given all the glitches, many people with disabilities were able to vote privately and independently for the first time in their lives.
I'm really excited today because today is the first time that I may or may not be able to vote freely and independently and confidentially for the first time in my life. There is a new accessible polling site which I'm going to intend to go try out and use. It's over on Adams Street in downtown Brooklyn, which is near where I live. It's about 5 to 6 blocks away. It's a little bit unfortunate that I have to go that far to vote freely and independently, because right in my building is actually the designated polling site for this part of Brooklyn Heights.
I got here today, the first thing I noticed is that there's no accessible parking near the polling site. And so I had to park in one of the end spots and improvise, basically, so I wouldn't get cut off in my lift-equipped van. The second problem I encountered at my polling site today was the fact that the door is only about 26 inches clear. It doesn't meet the minimum standards for ADA compliance. So it's quite a struggle to open up that door and get through in my wheelchair and clear the door. When I got to the actual polling site and after I signed in to the actual voting machine, they had difficulty lowering the machine. They didn't know where the crank went and how far down to lower the machine. And so after a 5-minute delay, they did get the machine in the proper location and I was able to vote. It's always a struggle for me to go inside behind the curtains and vote because I have to position myself sideways to have the privacy I need to vote securely and privately, but I did get it done. And again, when I finished the voting process, I did exit the building with difficulty getting through that door, and we would love to get this voting site changed to a more accessible location.
New York State still had a long way to go before it even came close to full HAVA compliance. However, primary and election day of 2006 proved to be steps in the right direction. In the words of the late disability rights advocate Justin Dart, you need to vote as if your life depends on it, because it does. – 2007 saw a surge in activity and advocacy. It was a grueling 12 months tug of war. The prize? A fundamental right.
The aggressive advance of advocates resulted in the drafting of a comprehensive polling place access bill. Its purpose was to update state election law, improving accessibility and enforcement. Senator William Larkin agreed to sponsor and introduce the bill at the end of the 2007 session.
Do you support this bill?
I do. I think that it is a step forward to bring about some uniformity throughout the state.
Senator George Maziarz agreed to co-sponsor the bill in memory of Michael DeVinny, a staunch advocate and constituent who fought the good fight before his recent death. Problems continue to brew, however. The state's inability to comply with its updated election law forced a need to amend it for primary and election days 2007. This in order to continue using the lever voting machines and ballot marking devices at county-wide accessible voting sites. Given the legislature's delay, the State Board of Elections responded to the situation with inappropriate statements.
Evelyn, do you like lever machines as much as I do?
I love them, but the young people, I know, if it were me, I agree with you.
And I don't know, I'm a lever machine man, and I'm not going to be satisfied until I think the first spaceship arrives with a real sophisticated piece of machine we can use.
The light at the end of the tunnel appeared to glimmer in July 2007 when the legislature reconvened and passed a bill that amends election law.
Well, it extends the deadline for when we must replace the voting machines, and it provides for interim implementation of HAVA requirements to the extent that we can with the current voting machines. Specifically, it would provide that at each polling site that there be one machine that is equipped for individuals with disabilities.
At last, the situation seemed to be on the upswing.
Announce the results.
Ayes 137, no 0.
The bill is passed.
The plot thickened, however, when the State Board of Elections split over procedures related to the ballot marking devices at county-wide accessible polling places. The Democratic commissioners proposed integrated use of the ballot marking devices, while the Republican commissioners suggested segregated use of the sites. Advocates were outraged at the segregated proposal, writing over 500 letters in opposition in 5 days. The overwhelming response prompted the State Board of Elections to adopt the integrated procedures for the ballot marking devices during their executive session in August 2007. After the executive session, the State Board of Elections announced support for a plan to achieve one ballot marking device per polling place for Election Day 2008. But another roadblock occurred when many county elections commissioners and Board of Elections staff opposed the plan. Those in opposition scheduled a trip to Washington, D.C. after Labor Day to advance an amendment to H.R. 811. If passed, the amendment would have suspended the accessible voting rights of New Yorkers with disabilities under HAVA until 2010. The advocates rise to the occasion and helped to defeat the amendment with a flurry of phone calls and letters of opposition. A subsequent HAVA plan that the State Board of Elections submitted to the Department of Justice for review stipulates one ballot marking device per polling place. However, advocates scrutinized the plan and voiced their concerns over 3 critical flaws. First, the plan does not include scanners, so that votes cannot be counted the night of the election. Second, it allows county election commissioners to substitute uncertified direct recording electronic machines, or DREs, as ballot marking devices by turning off their counting devices and accepting their paper trails as ballots. And third, the plan fails to provide for a variety of accessible voting logistics, such as polling place access, accessible transportation, poll worker training, and public education. As the holidays approach in late December, the advocates receive a most welcome gift.
The United States versus New York State.
The State Board of Elections receives a kick in the derriere from a federal judge today.
All 49 other states in the country are already compliant with the Help America Vote Act, or HAVA. New York now has until January 4th, that's their deadline, to catch up and become the 50th. Only half kidding, today a federal judge stated that like Eisenhower in Little Rock, he would call out the National Guard, if that's what it's going to take to get electronic voting machines in place in New York State. His Honor's other option also said jokingly from the bench, throw the 4 New York State commissioners for elections in jail until they come up with a plan of their own. But the judge ultimately decided on something more diplomatic, a 2-week deadline for New York to devise a schedule to finally implement electronic voting.
The date had finally arrived. HAVA was finally implemented in New York. One of the founding states of the Union would be the last to adopt the right to vote privately and independently. Will people with disabilities respond? If you grant it, will they come?
I know that voters with disabilities have every desire to participate as much as they possibly can in this democracy.
Voters with disabilities have been so disenfranchised for so long that I think it's going to take time. I think that folks who have always been denied access, denied their right to vote at the polling site for 20, 30, 40, 50 years are not suddenly going to come back just because there's this law called HAVA.
This is much nicer than absentee. Because even when absentee, someone had helped me because I couldn't read the choices or mark them myself. This is much, much better.
It was a long and winding road to reach HAVA in New York, longer and harder than it ever had to be. Winning this fundamental right was a tribute to the painstaking efforts of the state disabilities community's perseverance, expertise, and technical assistance to help make voting machines in polling places accessible for all individuals with disabilities. The time had finally arrived to end this epic struggle for an independent, private voting process.
Today was a really special day for me. I had a real sense of independence to be able to exercise my fundamental rights, the right to vote.